Yes. Hi, Jenny. Welcome to the Andrea Holm podcast.
Hello.
I'm so happy to have you on.
I'm so glad to be here.
Can you introduce yourself to everybody out there watching and tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So I am Jenny Holm. I'm Andrea's cousin, and I currently live in Lithuania. I've lived here for about 1 year and 9 months, and prior to that, I lived in Sarajevo in Bosnia and Herzegovina for about 1 year and 4 months. And prior to that, I lived in Washington, D.C. for approximately 10 years. I've also lived for a time in Russia, in Georgia, the country, and I grew up in Minnesota near Andrea. I guess I should refer to you as you.
Yeah, it's so funny because I'm Andrea in the United States, but I've been Andrea for so long that I just switched to calling myself Andrea.
Talk about an identity shift.
Your name doesn't change in other languages, does it? You just stay as Jenny?
I call myself Jenny. When I was living in Russia, I often went by Zhenya, which is the short version of a Russian name Yevgenia, which isn't anything like Jenny, but Zhenya sounds a lot like it, and it's easier for people to pronounce. So I went with that. And now here in Lithuania, I'm Jenny, except for my partner's 5-year-old son, who calls me Zhenya.
Say it again, Zhenya.
Zhenya. Something like that.
It sounds nice.
Yeah, I'll take it.
When you introduce yourself, do you introduce yourself as Jenny, even in Russia, or did you introduce yourself as Zhenya?
I would usually, depending on who I was talking to, I would usually offer both. I would say my American-sounding name and then give people the option to just say Zhenya, and most would take it. Just because when you're speaking Russian, it just fits into the music of the language better. It breaks it a bit to say Jenny.
Cool.
When did you make the switch from Andrea to Andrea? Right away?
I don't think it was right away, but I don't think that it was even it wasn't a decision. I remember going home one time, and I was taking this course in Minnesota, and we all had to introduce ourselves. And when it came to me, I introduced myself as Andrea, and I was shocked to realize that had come out of my mouth. And then I had to say, like, oh no, I'm Andrea. I'm Andrea. I live in Spain. And then I felt like I was like, oh, sorry. It felt like I was showing off, but it had just come out. And I think that's when I realized it had become a thing.
Yeah. Sometimes you'd find it happening without even knowing yourself. That's so funny.
And now I notice that even like if I'm speaking with my sister and I'm telling a story about myself, I might say like, and she said Andrea, and I thought Andrea. So I even refer to myself now as Andrea, which even when I'm speaking to my sister, which seems strange.
It's funny how these things happen without our noticing over time.
So that leads into a good question that I wanted to... Well, can you explain your language journey briefly so that we understand your background in terms of languages?
Sure. So I did rhythmic gymnastics as a child, which is the gymnastics with the ribbons and the hoops and the balls. It's much more popular in Eastern Europe than it has historically been in the United States. And so the girls on my team and our coaches were primarily from Russia and Belarus and Ukraine and other parts of the former Soviet Union. And I got really interested in what they were saying. They were speaking a lot of Russian at the gym, and I started studying on my own in school. And then when I got to college, I was able to take actual classes, and I ended up majoring in Russian. And I lived in Russia for a while, and now that's my most fluent second language. I'm also learning Lithuanian now since I live here, and that is coming along, but it's not anywhere near as good as my Russian is.
I suppose they're fairly similar. Are they?
They are Not as similar as you might think, given how close Lithuania and Russia are. Actually, Russian is a Slavic language, and Lithuanian is a Baltic language, so they're two different families. And they are similar in terms of the grammatical structure of the language, but the vocabulary is almost totally different. So you're really starting from scratch.
Yeah. And you've been living there for how long now?
In Lithuania, 1 year and 9 months. But out of the US, 3 years total for now, plus about 1.5 years from earlier in my life.
And in acquiring Lithuanian, are you able to communicate well? And
I'm able to communicate. I wouldn't say I'm able to communicate well. I sound pretty ridiculous when I try. But it's, I think one specificity of living in Lithuania is that in the capital city, in Vilnius, where I live, almost everyone speaks English if they're under the age of about 40. Over the age of 40, most people's second language is Russian. So between those two languages, I could get by without speaking Lithuanian at all. I don't want to. I think it's valuable to learn the language of where you are, and I can participate more in public life if I learn it. But I always have the choice. And that is to some extent a drawback, because I can always fall back on something else. I'm not forced to learn it, and that has slowed me down. I would say my partner's 5-year-old son is my best teacher, because he doesn't care that I sound ridiculous, and he just continues speaking Lithuanian and doesn't seem to notice that I'm making mistakes right and left. Sometimes he corrects me, which is helpful.
Awesome.
But yeah.
I was thinking about that because I was realizing that, like, as adults, it's one of the hardest things about learning a language is you feel embarrassed to make mistakes. And the way we learn languages naturally is, as a kid, you make thousands of mistakes, and the other kids are also making thousands of mistakes. So you all kind of have this fluidity of learning a language. Whereas when you learn as an adult, every mistake feels, especially for people who are used to like demanding a lot of respect from the people around them in terms of their career, it can be really like shocking to have to lower the level of respect that you demand from people because of your lack of language skills.
That's so accurate. Yes. And it feels like asking a lot of people who can speak English quite well to allow you to practice by speaking to you in Lithuanian, thereby slowing the conversation down, decreasing the level of interaction, making it awkward for both of you. It feels like, why bother? But if you don't, you'll never learn. You just have to just work through that, I think.
Yeah,
How
it's true.
was it for you with Spanish? Did you find that you had to ask people to speak English, or was it easier because people didn't really speak it?
I guess in the same sense, my Spanish journey has been really long because I started in Costa Rica and then in Mexico and now here in Spain. So in Costa Rica, I couldn't even really defend myself in Spanish. People were more willing to like teach me little things here and there, but in a sense, they were also working on their English, and my Spanish was so poor that we just had to get by with whatever we could between the two of us, which worked, or between the two people speaking. In Mexico is where I really realized that I didn't have a personality. I remember feeling really frustrated because I would go to like a social gathering or a party, and I felt like my Spanish was good enough to talk to people, but I realized really quickly that the conversation was so limited that I was just boring. I felt so boring in Spanish, and I kept thinking, you don't realize I'm a really interesting person. I have lots of things we could talk about, but yeah, you require so much patience from people to get there.
Oh, that is so familiar. I hate feeling boring, and I feel boring all the time. It's just, it kills me.
It's so interesting because I also think like, sometimes I think if I were to go back home to Minnesota, all of these things that make me confusing to you, the things that are related to culture and to language, those would no longer be a problem for me. Plus, I would be this girl who lived in Europe for so long. So you just think I could really be a star back in Minnesota, and here I'm just trying to get by. Every day is a struggle. Do you feel like that's
Yes.
living there?
Oh, completely. And like, on the one hand, there is this wish to kind of go back and rest on my laurels, we say, basically just benefit from the fact that, oh, I lived abroad. But actually, there's a part of me that really likes the struggle and every day being a bit of an adventure and kind of feeling confused myself a lot of the time. It's frustrating, but it's also really interesting. So I guess it's a battle between wanting to be interesting myself and wanting to feel interested by everything that is going on around me in my daily life, because I don't fully understand it.
Yeah, I really identify with that. I've always said that I think living abroad suits me really well because I like the built-in challenge from everyday life. So every morning you wake up and there's always going to be something confusing and frustrating and struggling, and you kind of have this race to survive, even if it's not real about surviving, but making friends, being a social person, feeling like you have a community and that you fit in, defending yourself in terms of your career. Like, it's such a challenge. So if you're the kind of person who likes built-in challenges, you've got it made living abroad, or at least that's my experience.
Yeah, that's so true. And I didn't realize, I realized it to some extent when I moved to Europe. I moved for work, so I had traveled a lot, largely in connection with work before. So to some extent, I knew what I was getting into. But I think when you settle down and live in a place and really, okay, I have to make my life here, you are confronted with a new set of challenges. And I didn't realize the extent to which that particular one would both frustrate and motivate me every day.
Mm-hmm. Do you plan on staying there long term, or how do you see that in your future in terms of Lithuania?
I think right now I would like to try to stay long term. It's still very much up in the air. I met my partner here, and we are just in the stage of figuring out what this looks like, and is it going to be long term? How do we do that? How do we make it work? Because she's from here, and she has a child, so it's not easy for her to just go somewhere else. And for me, that's an adjustment because I moved here thinking that it would be not long term. I didn't have a plan for what would happen after I left here, but I wasn't planning to spend my adult life in Lithuania. And now that I'm thinking about maybe doing that, there's a lot of mental shift that has to go on in terms of my commitment to learning the language and to building a community, to understanding just the ins and outs of how you do an adult life here. Should I buy property? Can I? What does that look like? There's a lot of questions that I didn't expect to have to confront. And now that I'm thinking about it, it's, again, both scary and exciting.
What do you think are the biggest challenges in terms of the culture there for you, or the things that you like best and the things that are most difficult for you?
I think one thing that is challenging is that people are more reserved here than they are, I think, anywhere in the U.S. To some extent, this is actually a relief, I'm realizing, because even though it's very different, there's something for me that is calming about realizing that I don't have to fill silences with words and questions and small talk. That is not expected here, and it's not really wanted in many cases. People often just want to be free to have their own thoughts or to be with other people without having to come up with something to say. And that I have realized is a cultural pressure from life in the US and in Minnesota that is deeply ingrained in me. I felt very awkward just leaving silences when I first got here.
That's interesting because I've kind of had, maybe because I live in Spain, so Spain is a very social culture and very like verbal and loud. And I spent a couple summers in Norway, as you know.
Oh, very different.
Yes. And not only that, I was in this like rural, I was on an island in the north of Norway. So the people around me were very like rural Norwegian. And I felt more at home there. I thought maybe this is because I grew up in Minnesota and we're kind of more introverted, I think, or like the culture is more quiet and not so social. So being there with people who, I got the feeling that anytime that we saw each other through the windows or walking around, like we wanted to say hello, but at the same time, you didn't want to commit to too much social interaction. So both of us were like, okay, here goes. And I identified with that because of Minnesota, but it sounds like to you it felt kind of the opposite.
I think it's a spectrum. I think, and for me, Lithuania feels like it's on one end and Minnesota feels like kind of in the middle, and then Spain and Italy and Georgia maybe over here. There's one thing that struck me was that when you are out with a friend or whoever here, and that person you are with comes across someone they know in the street, they might stop to talk to them for however long, say 2 minutes. There is no obligation culturally for them, your friend, to introduce you to the person that they are speaking. They don't have to explain the relationship. They don't need to tell you who that person is or who you are to the other person. And to me, when this first happened, I was like, well, this seems rude. Like, I can't, who are you? Are you ashamed of me? What's going on? And it's just culturally not done. Whereas in the US, that's so basic. You have to, which is actually awkward. Like maybe you don't want to explain, and here you don't have to. So there's something nice about it, but it took some adjustment for me to realize that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Any other like interesting cultural components for you?
I think, yeah, people, there's much less pressure to put on a smile here for others, for strangers, for anyone. And this was the case here and also in Russia, where there's a stereotype about Americans that we're smiling all the time. And for me, that's often true. I mean, it's genuine. It's how my face looks. But I smile when I feel happy. I smile when I feel awkward. I smile a lot. And for them, I think there's a perception that if you are smiling at me, you must want something from me. What is it? It engenders suspicion.
It's like a salesman type approach. Yes. Interesting.
Yeah. And so sometimes it can make people more standoffish because they have to defend themselves against whatever it is that you're trying to, get from them. And I think that has made me try to turn it off sometimes, just to fit in a bit more and not scare people.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What about you?
In terms of cultural differences here in Spain?
Exactly, yeah.
I definitely feel a bit of that social aspect. I guess I'm a bit of an introvert, or I'm a reserved person. So with large groups, when I first came here, I was playing a lot of ultimate frisbee in order to like have a community. And in those tournaments or competitions, there was just so much time where you spent with the team and with the other teams. And besides that, I also had a group of friends from beach volleyball, and everything was done in large groups socially. And I remember feeling like, woo, this is challenging. And I thought like, well, I have to learn to do it. I'm going to adapt. I'll get better at it. And I guess especially since I started posting on social media and stuff, I have so much less time in my life. because social media requires a lot of, and it's a total challenge in itself. So I just also backed off a bit from all of that social interaction, and it felt like such a relief. So that was the point when I realized how much effort I had been putting into it. So I think the social interaction, I mean, here it's just, I also live in kind of a small town. It's not a big city like Madrid or Barcelona, so there is more of just community and family, that really close knit feeling of having known people for so long. It's a bit strange to be an outsider in that realm. So you have to work harder to develop a community and develop friendships, because in a way you're competing against people who have been friends for decades. Or a lot of the students I had who we had these one-to-one conversations with, they would tell me that at Christmas, when they had their Christmas meals with friends, most of the people at the table were people they went to elementary school with, which is something I'm not used to. Like, my life in the US, I was changing schools every few years. Then I went to university in a different state. Then I moved several times before moving abroad. So I have maybe one friend that I've had that long, and like family, but even with family, I don't stay in that close of touch. So it's, yeah, that community aspect and that social aspect has been totally different for me.
Wow. Yeah, can be so challenging. And I think that experience resonates with mine to some degree. I think that trying to build a community is probably the thing that I have struggled with the most abroad. And particularly here, I mean, it's been the pandemic this whole time. So there wasn't maybe as many opportunities to meet friends as I might have liked. I got very lucky in meeting my partner when I did, like near the beginning of the pandemic, and then you can make friends through, your partner. But it's still something that I struggle with, and but at the same time, I think I live in the capital city where a lot of people have come from somewhere else. They've traveled a lot. Many of them have lived abroad. If expats move to Lithuania, they're most likely to live here. So that makes it easier. I really applaud you for choosing to live in a place where it's difficult because of those tight-knit connections and the fact that people are less mobile. That would be such a challenge.
Yeah, I think having those sports teams really helped, or like even joining a gym where you were in classes regularly with people, so you didn't really have to ask them to meet you. It was just every Tuesday, Thursday at 4:00 so you could slowly build up sort of a relationship with people without having to ask, which to me felt so much easier.
And I think I hear a lot, and I say myself, how hard it is to meet people when you are an adult abroad. But it is difficult making friends as an adult anywhere, I think. And I was thinking about, okay, how do I do this in my life in the US, or how was I doing it when I lived in Washington? And the answer was exactly group activities that are scheduled, that you just show up at, and you see the same group of people over time, and things develop slowly. And so I tried to find that here. I've joined a choir, which has been awesome for just meeting people. Yeah. But it does require a certain amount of, this is where you need Lithuanian, where I couldn't get by just leaning on English and Russian, because all of the rehearsals are in Lithuanian. And while I can socialize with people in English because they speak it so well, in order to take part and be a fully fledged member of this group, I had to at least understand well enough to be able to follow what's going on. So learning language has been really key to social integration.
I was thinking if your way in had to do with this, you started a relationship and that allowed you to meet a lot of friends, does it kind of end up feeling like you don't get to bring as much to the table because you're kind of adapting to all of her friends and interests and things? Whereas at least with having a choir, there is something outside of the relationship that's yours and that you could bring in conversation topics and something new that, yeah.
I feel like that was a thing I was struggling with, in that it did feel very much like I was sort of tagging along with her in her life. And that wasn't because she required that. It was just, that's the reality of living abroad when you haven't had a chance to develop your own independent life as much. And so I realized, this is on me. I have to do something to change that. And she's been very supportive of that, which is all I can ask. So yeah, the choir is part of that. I think in Bosnia, I took salsa dance lessons, which was also a really great way to integrate, and didn't require a lot of language, because dance is something you can do without much speaking.
Body language.
Yeah. And I think now, like, bringing her to the United States, at least for a visit, so that she can understand a bit more about my friends there, my family, the context that I came from, is something that's very important to me and to her. But I've made the choice to live in her environment, and that it comes with some sacrifices.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember feeling that way when I first moved to Spain. I had a Portuguese boyfriend, and I remember thinking, like, everything, I mean, he was also living in Spain, so it was a new culture for both of us, but it was far more familiar for him, and the language and everything. And I remember thinking, like, automatically you have this step up from me, where there's so many things that you're showing me and that you're explaining to me and that I'm new at. And I kept thinking, I would so love to bring you to the United States just so that I could be the leader for a few times. Like, I want to take you on a canoe trip in the boundary waters in the north of the US, or camping, or show you, like, what a typical diner is. So I just wanted an opportunity to be the leader for a little while, just so I didn't always have to be the one tagging along, just to get a little bit of that confidence boost that comes from it. I was very much aware that it played a role in my personality. I seemed less confident in this other realm because I didn't get many opportunities to be the protagonist.
Yeah, I have used that word to describe this feeling, like realizing that my confidence took a little bit of a dive because I couldn't be as much myself and show myself in the ways that I wanted to. And I think I'm curious whether, when you did travel back to the US during that time in your life, did you kind of remember, oh yeah, this is how I want to feel? Or when you went back, did you have some kind of other experience?
That's a good question. I think I in that specific case, I never actually went with the boyfriend I had at the time, but I know that going home for me, it's a bit different because I've been living abroad for more than a decade. So when I go home, it's almost like I go back to my 18-year-old mindset, and it clashes with who I am now. So if I'm staying with my mom in her house or visiting my sisters or something, it's like I feel everyone relating to me as the me I was when I was 18. But there's this, like, strong personality that's the me now that kind of, like, doesn't know how to communicate that I'm not that same person anymore, or that, like, there's so much going on here that my brain is struggling to understand. So I feel like, no, it's never the experience I really expect it to be. How about for you?
I think it is different because I did live so much more of my adult life, like my 20s and part of my 30s in the US. And because I've gone abroad for my job, which is connected to the US, that I think there's more of a tight rope between the two of them. Like I'm still tethered there in many ways.
That makes sense.
But what I did find when I just went back after I was not home for a year and a half because of the pandemic. So I just went back last month for the first time in quite a while. And I was kind of reminded of that level of confidence that I have around my friends there, and just moving through the world in a space that I understand what's going on. And coming back to Lithuania, it was nice to remember that and to say, hey, I want to bring a little bit of that person into this place that I am now. But I think there's a process that occurs going back and forth where you're sort of integrating the self that you were there with the self that you are in your new place to some degree, or trying to bring them together.
Yeah, that's interesting. I always think
How do you feel? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I always think that going home and coming back, or going home to Minnesota or the US and coming back here, I always like those trips to be long, like almost to have long layovers and airports and stuff, just so that I have time to kind of sort through all the things that happen, and like changing between cultures, even like time zones and everything. I like to let it seep in a bit slower. So if it's too quick of a flight and too quick of a jump from one to the next, I can't assimilate it fast enough.
Yeah, it can be disorienting. I find that journaling on planes, I'm always tempted to journal on planes. It just seems to work well there in those in-between spaces. There's something very relaxing to me about that place, like inside of a plane.
Yeah, that makes sense. And having that, I like traveling alone in that aspect, like being by myself in airports. I really identify with that. It feels calming to me.
Yeah, because there's no pressure to engage with anyone else. You can be inside your own head and having your own thoughts and observations, and no one is bothering you to get in there.
I feel like our time is running out, so do you have any last... I would love to have you on again, by the way. It's been great to talk to you and hear your thoughts. And honestly, we haven't really caught up much in the last 10 years at least. I've seen you at some family gatherings, but because you're traveling and I'm traveling, we don't get to see each other very often. And I would love to chat with you more often.
Definitely. I was just going to say that I feel like it's really refreshing to have someone who came from, any expat, any American who travels and lives abroad, I think has some level of similarity, but especially with you who, we come from the same family. So it's really very much of the same background. And yeah, it's really refreshing. I love discussing these questions and love talking to you. So yeah, let's do it again.
Someday, one question I want to ask in the future, so we can just leave it there, is I'm really curious about how your personality is different in English and in Russian, I would say. So we can leave that for the next one.
Yeah, let's talk about that next time. I wanted to ask you the same thing.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on and for agreeing to be my first, I guess you could say you're my second podcast guest. And thank you for being brave and going for it.
It's my pleasure. I really enjoyed it. So thanks for the invitation and looking forward to next time.
Yeah. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Bye, Jenny.